I want to welcome you to this session on Facebow record transfer. And in this session, we would look at what the Facebow is. We'll look at the parts of the Facebow. We would also look at the classification of Facebow. We would talk about the importance of Facebow. And then we go through the steps that we require in order to take a Facebow record, and then transfer that record onto an articulator. So we want to first start with what a Facebow is. So according to the glossary of prosthodontic terms, a Facebow is a caliper-like device that is used to record the spatial relationship of the maxilla to certain anatomical reference points, namely a posterior reference point referred to as the terminal hinge axis, and then an anterior reference point. And then this record is then transferred onto an articulator. So by definition, we say a Facebow is a caliper-like device which is used to record the spatial relationship of the maxilla to certain anatomic reference point, and then that is transferred onto an articulator. Now we'll continue to look at what the components of a Facebow is. So for the purposes of today's demonstration, we are going to use a semi-adjustable, we're going to use a Facebow with a semi-adjustable articulator. The type of Facebow that we're going to use today is called the BioAct Facebow. It's an arbitrary type of Facebow. Alright, so we'll come to the classifications. Now, the first part that I want us to look at is what we call the U-shaped frame. So this is a U-shaped frame. Now, with some types of Facebows, you have the U-shaped frame together with another component. Okay, but this U-shaped, metallic structure that we see is what we refer to as the U-shaped frame. And the U-shaped frame has the condylar rods, or what we call the earpiece. So these rods would be fitted into the external acoustic meatus of the patient. So you place it and it goes into the external acoustic meatus. And remember, from our definition, we said that we are recording the spatial relationship of the maxilla to certain anatomic reference points. But one of the reference points is the terminal hinge axis. The terminal hinge axis is a straight line that can be drawn from one end of the condyle to the other end. Alright, so the condylar rods or the earpiece fits into the external acoustic meatus, okay? And then anteriorly, there is a point for us to relate that posterior reference point to an anterior reference point. So depending on the type of articulate Facebow you are using, you may have an orbital pointer, also attached to the U-shaped frame that helps you to locate your anterior reference point. In the case of this particular type of articulator, instead of having an orbital pointer, we have a Nasion relator, which comes like this. And this Nasion relator is fitted onto the U-shaped frame. Okay, so as we get to the steps by which we can take the Facebow record, we would demonstrate how to fit this Nasion relator. Okay. Now, aside the U-shaped frame, we also have a very important component of the Facebow referred to as a locking device. Okay, so the locking device attaches to the U-shaped frame, and it has clamps on it. Okay, and these clamps or these screws will help us to lock the final record and make sure that that record can be kept static until it is transferred onto what? An articulator. Alright, so don't forget, this is a locking device. We also refer to the locking device sometimes as a transfer jig. Okay, so when you hear a transfer jig, it's the same as what? The locking device. Okay. Then, aside the locking device, we have a very important component here known as the bite fork. The bite fork. So the bite fork is important because it helps us to obtain an imprint of the maxillary, teeth, and these imprints will help us in mounting of our cast on the articulator. Now the bite fork comes in two main designs. So there's a design for patients who have teeth in their mouth. So either partially dented patients or fully dented patients. Then we also have another design which is not here, which is for edentulous patients. Alright, so remember that we can have a bite fork meant for edentulous patients and then another for what? Dentate patients. Okay. Now, aside the components of the Facebow, we also have an articulator here, and this is a semi-adjustable articulator. Okay, and according to the glossary of orthodontic terms, an articulator is basically a mechanical device to which a maxillary and a mandibular cast can be mounted. Alright, so a mechanical device to which a maxillary and a mandibular cast can be mounted. Okay. Alright, now let's talk about the types of Facebows. So generally we have two main types of Facebow. We have the arbitrary Facebow, and the one I just showed you is an example of an arbitrary type of Facebow. Then we have the kinematic Facebow. Now, with the kinematic Facebow, it is a type that gives us an accurate location of the terminal hinge axis. So we can virtually be able to determine the exact point where the terminal hinge axis is, and then we place our posterior reference point at that specific point. However, it is a very complex Facebow. It is expensive and it is time consuming because you need to locate landmarks on the face, and these landmarks would help you to be able to locate the exact position of the terminal hinge axis. Then we also have the arbitrary type of Facebow. The arbitrary type is very simple to use, it's inexpensive, and like I said, the arbitrary type of Facebow can have earpieces or condylar rods that fits into the station or the external acoustic meatus. Now, it produces a certain margin of error. Okay, it is said to produce about 5 millimeter margin of error because it doesn't really give us the exact location of the terminal hinge axis, but it gives us a location that is very close. Okay, and its use has not been shown to impact negatively on the final record. Now, the arbitrary Facebow also has two types. Okay, so we have the earpiece type and then we have the fascia type. The type that we are going to use today is the earpiece type. Okay. We also want to move on to look at why is it important for us to take a Facebow record. Why is it important? And remember, from the definition we say that we are recording the spatial relationship of the maxilla to the terminal hinge axis. Why are we not using the mandible? The mandible is a movable structure, and so it is very difficult for us to be able to reproduce the exact location of the mandible at any point in time. However, the maxilla is joined to the skull base, and therefore if we use the maxilla as a reference point, then we can always be able to reproduce that particular point. Assuming that we lose the, let's say you take a record and then you mount your maxillary and mandibular cast, and for some reason you lose the record that you have taken, it is very possible to use the maxilla together with those anatomic reference points to get a new record, which you can use to mount your maxillary and your mandibular cast. One of the things a Facebow record also helps us to do is to properly orient or obtain the exact orientation of the occlusal plane. So most times we assume that the occlusal plane is parallel. You take a patient's maxilla, you might think that is parallel, okay, to the floor. But sometimes there is some angulations, which we call canting of the occlusal plane. So you would have the occlusal plane canted or slanted in a particular way. And studies have shown that a number of individuals have canted occlusal planes. So if you were to do a freehand mounting of your maxillary and mandibular cast, you may, in some instances, miss this, variations in terms of how the occlusal plane, is. It also helps us to be able to determine the intercondylar distance. Again, another importance of the Facebow record is that it helps us to determine the intercondylar distance and its relationship with the distance from the terminal hinge axis to the occlusal plane. And that is very important because depending on how wide the intercondylar distance is, it can have an effect on the condylar angle guidance, okay? And that would also have an effect on the arrangement of your teeth, okay? Taking into consideration the cuspal angles of your teeth that you are going to use for your setup, okay? So it's been found out that the wider the intercondylar distance, the wider the cuspal angles should be away from each other, okay? And of course, the Facebow record helps us to be able to appropriately, articulate the maxillary cast to the mandibular cast, which means that once we know the orientation of the maxilla in space, we can be able to articulate the mandible to that particular orientation. Okay, so let's keep this in mind. Now we're going to go through the steps or the stages that we need to follow when we want to take a Facebow record. The first thing we need to do is to take a bite, okay, or an imprint of the maxillary teeth, okay. So remember, in Facebow record, we are not concerned about the mandible, because once we can get orientation of the maxilla and we take our occlusal records, we can easily be able to orient the mandibular cast to the maxillary cast. So this is our bite fork, and that's what we are going to use to make our imprint, okay, of the maxillary teeth. So I'm going to ask her to take off her face mask off. And then, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to position her, okay? And the usual position is for the patient to sit at right angles, okay? So we adjust the chair, okay? So assuming, can you push her? So assuming you sit the patient this way, you are supposed to reposition this patient such that the head would be parallel to the floor, okay? So the patient's head should be parallel. There are various ways that we can use to do, but arbitrarily we can be able to position the head of the patient, all right? Then we also need to explain to the patient what we are coming to do, okay? So we're going to take a Facebow record for you. It's not a very painful, it's not a painful procedure. I'm going to take a bite, okay, of your teeth, and then I'm going to apply an instrument, okay, around your face. to help us take this record. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is to take a bite or make an imprint of the maxillary teeth. Now, what materials can we use? So we can use wax, okay? So we can use like 2 sheets of wax, and then we place it on the surface of the bifork. Now the bifork has points on it, so it has an indentation which tells you which part should face upwards. So I'll bring this closer for you to see the indentation, okay, at the upper part here, which tells you that this part of the bifork should be facing upwards, okay? So aside wax, we could also use a polyvinyl siloxane material, okay? We could use a blue mousse material, okay, which usually comes in a cartridge and a gun, and you can syringe it onto the bifork. With the blue mousse material, you can place it at 3 different points. You can have an anterior, a posterior, 2 posterior, so on the right and then on the left, okay? But we are going to use modeling wax for the purposes of this demonstration. So I'll take a wax and then I'm going to place it in some warm water. Then I'm going to place it on top of the fork. Remember, we are only interested in the maxillary teeth, so it is not necessary for it to cover the under surface of the bifork, okay? So we remove the excess. Okay, so we have our first sheet of wax on like this. Then we place another sheet in order to make sure we are able to get the imprint of the maxillary teeth. Alright, so we have our bifork with the wax placed on it. I must say that we need to relieve the anterior, a little bit of the anterior portion of the fork, so that so that we can be able to place it in a midline, okay, to ensure that it's placed in the midline. So this is the bifork and this is the stem of the fork. So you hold the stem of the fork and then you ask the patient to open the mouth without tilting the head, okay? Again, I'm going to put it in the warm water a bit, warm it up, and then I'm going to sit it. The patient is not going to bite on it. So you have to enter from one end, making sure that you are positioning the fork in the middle, okay? And then you press it against the maxillary teeth so they can make an imprint, okay? And once you are satisfied, you have to hold this bifork in place, okay? So you can let the patient assist you, or you can put some cotton rolls for the patient to bite on to keep it in a stable position. And I'm going to ask her to use her thumb to hold the bifork in position. Once that is done, we now take our U-shaped frame to which we have our locking device attached, okay? And the first thing we do is to open it up, and then the ear rods will go into the external acoustic meatus. But note that this can sometimes cause some discomfort to the patient, and so you need to be gentle about it. Okay. But before you attach this U-shaping, you make sure that the screws are loose. You loose up the screws, okay, for easy manipulation. Okay. All right. So we have the ear rods in place. Now we need to place our anterior reference point. So once the ear rods are in, we have our posterior reference point. Okay. Now we need to place our Nasion relator. So in this case, we don't have an orbital pointer, but we have a Nasion relator. So you attach the Nasion relator. Again, you can loose up this screw. All right. And it goes straight to the Nasion. Okay, so the Nasion is a midpoint, okay, in the bridge of the nose. Okay, and you make sure that the relator is in contact with the Nasion, and then you tighten it in place. Okay, so once that is in place, you now have to ensure that the locking device goes into the stem of your bite fork. Okay, so if it were an orbital pointer, you're going to place it at a point below the infraorbital margin. The specific point is called the orbitale. And a straight line from the orbitale to the chorion gives you what we call the Frankfurt plane. Okay, so you can use the Frankfurt plane as well. We could also use the alar tragal line as well as a horizontal reference point. Okay. So once you are satisfied with the position of your Nasion relator and the locking device has gone into the stem, you can now lock up. You can now lock up the screws. Okay. If you don't lock them up well, you end up losing the record. So I'm locking it up. In some articulators, the screws are numbered. So you start from number 1 to the last screw. Alright, so once we are satisfied with our record, we can now take off. So you can take off your hands now. So we now take off the Facebow record. So this is our Facebow record now. You can see I can turn it anyhow, but because I've locked it tightly, I'm not going to lose my record. Now, once you take out this record from the patient's mouth, you have to disinfect the record. Because remember, you have put this into the patient's mouth. So you could use sodium hypochlorite, okay, 0.5% or 2% butyraldehyde, spray, okay. So you spray the record. If you don't have that, you can immerse this into a holding solution for 10 minutes, okay, and then you can take it out. Now once we have this record, we are now ready to transfer this record onto an articulator. All right, so I'm going to put this record down and I'm going to take the articulator. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit about this articulator. So this is a semi-adjustable articulator. So we look at the parts. It has mounting plates. So it has an upper mounting plate, a lower mounting plate here, and then it has an incisal pin, okay, incisal guidance pin, okay, which helps us to maintain the vertical dimension, okay, of occlusion, okay. And if we want to alter the vertical dimension, we can still use this incisor guide pin to help us to be able to achieve that. Then you have an incisor guide pin table, okay, and on this table we can be able to perform various range of motions, so protrusive movements, and we can do lateral excursive movements, okay. Now we have the condylar elements, okay, the condylar elements, so they are on both sides, okay. The condylar elements have adjustments, okay. So there's an adjustment for the condylar guide or condylar guidance, okay, which helps in protrusive movements. Is that okay? So as you hold this articulator, you can virtually have protrusive movements as the condyle glides along the what? The artificial or glenoid, fossa, all right, or glenoid cavity, okay. So this semi-adjustable articulator allows us to do two main adjustments, okay. So protrusive movements, okay, we can be able to adjust the angle to give us that, and then also lateral excursive movements, which we also refer to as the Bennett movement. So there are adjustment knobs. So for protrusive movements, usually set at 30-degree angle, okay. So there's a point here, okay, you just have to look very carefully, and you see marks from 0 to 60. So we can adjust by moving this, okay, but it's usually set at 30 degrees. Then for lateral excursive movements, it's usually set at 15 degrees, okay. And so if you set it higher, then it means you can have more lateral movements of your articulator, okay, but usually it's set at 15 degrees, okay. So let's see how we are going to mount or transfer our Facebow record. All right. So if you want to transfer your Facebow record, so first of all you have to attach the condylar rods, okay. But before then, you have to open your articulator. You have to open the upper part of the articulator. Then you now insert, so there are pins on each side of the condylar elements, and then you sit all right, so you sit this in place. Then the Facebow also has a support, okay. It has a support. So I'm going to put that support here. All right, okay. So you have it supported. Now, other types of articulators have special mounting plates, okay, on which you can be able to mount your Facebow record. Now, once this is in place, we can safely then put our maxillary cast. So, assuming this is the cast, okay, the maxillary cast for the patient. Remember, we've already obtained an imprint. Then we place the maxillary cast into the imprint, okay, like this. Another way of doing it is, before you mount the Facebow, you can place the maxillary cast onto your imprint, and then use a rubber band to tie it, okay, around it to keep it in that stable position before you now attach it to the what? Articulator. All right, so whichever way, you know, works very fine. So we attach this back again, and before I attach, I would want to draw attention to some. So most articulators have what we call a bifork support. Okay, bifork support, but it's optional. Some have it, some don't have. This one doesn't have it. Okay, and I don't think that should be a big deal. Okay, so but if you have a cast support, then you remove the lower mounting plate and place that support there, okay, so that when you now attach your Facebow, it can support the bifork, so that you won't have a change in your record. Okay, so I'm going to fix this back, and then I have my Facebow support there, so this is stable now. So I can now place my maxillary cast into the imprint. So make sure that the maxillary cast is fitted into the imprint. Then remember that we're going to attach this cast to the upper mounting plate, okay, which means that we need to create some retentive grooves on our cast, the land area of our cast. So we need to create retentive grooves. Then we mix a plaster material, okay, onto this area, and then we put the, so by then we can take off our Nation relator. So our cast is there. So you see the cast has come off. So if you had secured it with a rubber band, it would have still been, you know, in place. All right, then we close up. We can take off the incisor guide pin for the meantime. Okay, so we have our model there. Then we have our plaster in here. Okay, so once we place our plaster, we shape it nicely, okay, and allow it to set. Once it sets, we have now obtained the orientation of the maxillary cast in space. Is that okay? And it's the same as what we have in the patient's mouth. Is that okay? And so once the maxillary cast has been mounted, we now have to turn the articulator upside down. All right, so you turn the articulator upside down like this. Okay, but by then you would have to remove your Facebow, okay, because once you've mounted the maxillary cast, you no longer need your Facebow. Remember, the Facebow is just helping you to mount the maxillary cast. Okay, so I'll put the incisor pin back. Okay, so let's say that the maxillary cast has been mounted like this. To be able to articulate the lower mandibular cast to the maxillary cast, we need to turn the articulator upside down like this. All right. Now, how do we know exactly how the mandibular cast will orient or would fit into the maxillary cast? So for dented patients, we usually take an interocclusal record. So we can take what we call a CR bite, centric relation bite. Okay, usually we can use a polyvinyl siloxane material. We can use wax. Okay, so we take that bite, then we now place that bite on them to fit into the maxillary teeth. But remember, for the CR bite, it has an imprint of both the maxillary teeth and the mandibulary teeth. So once you now place it onto the maxillary teeth or the maxillary cast, the imprints for the mandibular teeth are there for you to see. So all you need to do now is to place the mandibular cast. Okay, so imagine that you have a CR bite record, okay, that is covering this. Then it will help you to know exactly how to fit it. So you don't have to do guesswork. Is that okay? All right, so I'll take this off. So you fit it in place like this. Again, you create retentive grooves. You would have created that already. And you mix your plaster, place it on it, and then the lower mounting plate now goes over it. Okay, and once it sets, you are done with your what? Articulation. Okay, and so with the articulation now, you can now be able to do all kinds of movements. Okay, you can be able to duplicate protrusive movements. You can be able to duplicate lateral excursive movements. Okay, and if you want to change the vertical dimension, that can also be done as well. All right, so this process is reproducible because we are using reference points that we can always go back to obtain. So in short, in this video we have looked at what a Facebow is. We've looked at the components of the Facebow. We've looked at the types of Facebow, arbitrary and kinematic. We've also looked at the importance of the Facebow record. And finally, we've gone through the stages, the steps in taking a Facebow record. And I believe that if you are able to do this very well, you would obtain very good articulation, which can help you in whatever procedure or prosthesis that you want to fabricate for your patients. Thank you very much for your attention.